Welcome to the Trans-Apocalyptic Oasis Show. I am Marshall Eon, and I'm joined here today by Lukas Eidolon. Is that right?
It is indeed.
Lukas is the founder of the Warden Post.
Co-founder, actually.
Co-founder.
That is an honor I share with Alexander Graf von Norstall.
Okay, he's a co-founder. And you're also the co-founder of the Metamodern Right group. Is that right?
Yes, that was a group that I set up a while back, trying to kind of bring people who were maybe from like different, maybe they were from like traditionalist or rightist perspectives, but also were more, let's say, sympathetic to like what we might call like futurism, right? They weren't like medievalists or, you know, what you see in like neo-pagan circles or like right-wing neo-pagan circles where, oh, you know, we just need to go back to like the return to monkey people. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but no. Okay. Basically like.
Oh, Return to Monkey. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. But it's
I
like.
thought you meant Return to Monkey People.
No. But no, like that group was kind of set up as an experiment, right? To see like, okay, well, we can kind of let's try to fish for people who maybe are on the right, or maybe they're, you know, right-leaning postmodern types or integral types, and let's just kind of bring some new blood to the scene that isn't the same rehashing of like, oh, we gotta, you know, like revolt against the modern world and talk about how decadent everything and everyone is, right? But yeah, I mean, it really is more of an excuse for me to just share my taste in vaporwave music, to be honest at this point.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like there's a strong emphasis on aesthetics there, but I already have a bunch of questions. So you identify as right?
Yes.
Right wing or rightist?
Yes, I do.
Okay, which obviously makes you a Nazi.
Oh.
So what kind of.
What's funny is like, you know, when people accuse me, and I have been accused of like, you know, I have been accused of being every like extreme part of every extremist ideology under the sun, right? Which is fine, you know, just don't accuse me of being a moderate, because then I'll be upset.
A moderate.
Yeah. But no, it's like I make this joke, right? It's like, you know, you're obviously just a crypto Nazi or something. It's like, no. You know, the Nazis were, you know, they thought that post-impressionism was degenerate art, and I'm a big fan of post-impressionism. So, you know.
So you differ from the Nazis in your art taste, but that's it.
No. It's, see, this is the thing.
So hold on a sec. So you identify as like a national socialist, right?
Well, I wouldn't use that word, because I feel like national socialism, I would use the word.
You're a socialist nationalist.
Yes, national socialism. Like, okay, let me explain. If you use national socialism, is as it was manifested during the Third Reich, was essentially an ideology of race-based totalitarianism, right? I am much like, which, you know, like if you're a Nazi, you think that's great, right? But I'm not like, my whole thought process isn't trying to like create like a, you know, a race of Ubermensch types that are just going to go like steamroll the world or something. I don't like, but I've always used the term maybe social nationalist or right-wing socialist or something like analogous to those terms. One, because I've always had a immense distrust of capitalism. Like back in the day, I never went through what was called the libertarian to alt-right pipeline. Like even during my early 20s, like I was never like I never got into Rand or Rothbard or any of these other types. Like to me, like I just, you know, when I read these critiques of capitalism and the you know, maybe the apologies for capitalism or free market economics, like it never rubbed me the right way. It just seemed like everything comes down to like quantity. And I knew that there were values that were above like the material, which got me into my traditionalism, you know. But yeah, like I would describe myself as a social nationalist in the same vein as people maybe like Father Coughlin or Huey Long in the American tradition. I also identify with like anti-imperialist groups. You know, I would actually be very fond, or I guess, you know, fond would be the right word, of, you know, some aspects of the anti-colonial movement that took place in the global South. I'm very much for the sovereignty of all peoples to pursue their own destinies. I'm not like what might be called like a supremacist in like the chauvinistic sense. You know, I think every people has the right to pursue their own destinies, to defend their own cultures. I think that is a God-given right to any people. Not just, you know, I mean, it's easy to kind of like emphasis what's going on in Europe because, you know, as someone who is on the right and someone who sees the situation happening in Europe, like, well, European cultures are under attack. But I also maintain that there are certain, you know, let's call them peoples outside of Europe who are suffering just as much. Like I would be supportive of movements such as the liberation of Tibet or the Uyghurs in East Turkestan or the Kurdish people scattered around as they are in that kind of pocket in the Middle East.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said. Like, I'm very much in favor of nationalism, however you want to define that. I'm very much in favor of workers' sovereignty over their own labor. You know, I mean, like, I hate that. What made me sour. I mean, but then again, here's the thing: is back in the day, I was a left winger. I was something that could be, you know, I was very much inclined towards the classical industrial unionism of the Wobblies, right? You know, the industrial workers of the world, the IWW. Um, I was very much a vocal supporter of people like Bernie Sanders back before he even ran, which is something I deeply regret now. That, you know, he strikes me like, having seen him like rabble rouse for certain causes and have him actually be a run as a candidate, a political candidate. It's like it was obvious to me that this guy is just kind of like a jellyfish of a man. Like, anyway, my point being is I've known that something was wrong with what we might call neoliberalism or global finance capitalism. These are
Okay.
things that I've always been, you know, heavily against. And I've seen the destructiveness of it, not just in terms of how they abuse people, in terms of like, you know, imposing debt servitude and crushing poverty, but how they treat every race, culture, and ethnicity on the planet as just like these little modes of, cogs rather, of labor and capital that can be moved around willy nilly without any regard of the local cultures or histories of
Right.
these places. Like I've always seen that as incredibly diabolical.
Yeah. So
I've always been,
that's kind of a green critique.
oh yes, we're gonna be using I guess more of like the integral spiral
We'll
dynamic.
touch on that, you know.
Okay,
It's a useful frame. So I already have a bunch of questions. So
sure thing.
um, you said you were always suspicious of capitalism.
Yes,
You had mentioned to me before you were reading Julius Evola.
yes. Back in the day, Evola. So back in my early 20s, I um I was a stardent, or I'm sorry, an ardent anti-modernist. But even when growing up, I always had a love for the mythic, the heroic, the legendary. You know, I grew up reading stories from the Bible and stories from classical mythology, and I emulated that. You know, I tried to apply those values, however shallow I could actually, embody them into my life. Like I was always kind of nostalgic for maybe this time, whether it was, lost in the mists of primordial history, where the gods or God, dwelt personally with human beings, and there were like these great stories of heroism and divinity, right? And growing up, that kind of fueled a lot of my anti-modernist outlook. And it was around, I think, my early 20s. I had to have stumbled across. Well, no, first, actually, my gateway to the right, let's call it that, was reading Oswald Spangler's The Decline of the West in my sophomore year of high school. That was probably what set me on the course where I am now. But after Spangler, I had come across the works of Julius Evola, who, if you even a cursory reading of the man's, biography reveals that he was the anti-modernist par excellence, right? And I think shortly after I had read, I'm sorry, I think it was around my, when I was 21, I had picked up a copy of Revolt and came away thinking, this is what I believe, and I've never been able to express it in words before. And I basically devoured every single book by Evola I could get my hands on. It's not an exaggeration to say that Julius Evola, for me, was something of a spiritual godfather for the majority of my early to mid 20s. And that also set me down a course where I really wanted to dive into the esoteric or the wisdom traditions of the world. Like, I have read the holy books, the sacred literature of essentially every major world religion, right? Sometimes more than once. Like I try to make it a point to read the New Testament every Lent, but I've also read the Upanishad and the Bhagavad Gita multiple times. I've read the Quran once. I want to revisit it. Eventually, the Tao Te Ching, the Analects of Confucius. Like, I mean, if there is a major world religion with a holy book, chances are I've read it. But, I was really just caught up in this expectation. Well, like, I know there's what the traditionalists call the Sophia Perennis, like the primordial wisdom of the world. And I tried to, by delving into these books, I wanted to really, get at the heart of, what brings man closer to the divine, to the absolute, to what is truly beyond being. And, it was around my studies of sacred literature, I came across the works of Renee, who could be said to be the founder of the traditionalist school, brilliant metaphysician. His works are a little bit
What was
more,
his name?
Renee Guinan.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Brilliant metaphysician. His stuff comes off as far more academic than Evola's, which makes him a wee bit harder to read. Although that might just be a thing with French authors, I've noticed. But yeah, like throughout the course of my mid 20s, I was enveloped in my search for the divine, right? And I had been studying secular philosophy alongside of this. I think I was probably reading Nietzsche alongside a bunch of other authors. And I think roughly during that period, I had identified religiously or spiritually as a pagan. For roughly 3 years, I think I dabbled in Asatru, which for people who may not know what that is, it's essentially the Nordic tradition or Nordic paganism, right? But that didn't really stick well with me. I never really agreed with polytheism, I guess. So after that, I began reading the Neoplatonist works, like the Enneads of Plotinus, and that resonated with me far more. And after Plotinus, I was introduced via Neoplatonism to the Eastern Church Fathers, I think specifically the Alexandrian Church Fathers. And that got me interested in Eastern Christianity or Greek Christianity. And and granted, this was like during the years of like 2015 to 16, or before, I'm sorry, before 2016. And this was when, you saw like this traditionalist boom, I think, on social media, and Eastern Orthodoxy was a part of it. So I thought, you know what? Hey, I think there's an Eastern Orthodox church near where I live. Let me go check it out. And immediately I was caught up in it. Like I felt like this is where I need to be. Although, granted, it was difficult and admittedly still is difficult for me to abandon some of my old pagan presuppositions about the world, about human nature, about anthropology. But for the most part, I was received into the church. I tried to adhere as well as possible to the teachings of the church and the lifestyle of the church. And during that phase, I kind of got, it's really well known in Orthodox circles that, newer converts have what's called convertitis, right? Where they become like, you have like these catechumens who, they're learning about Orthodoxy and they get so like fired up by it. And they feel like, oh, we need to just kind of root out these modernist influences and all this other stuff. And I was a part of it, admittedly. And some of my earlier works for the Warden Post were internet crusade in nature. However, this got me into a debacle online with a few priests, actually. And I was really like, I was up on my high horsey, let me put it like that. I thought, oh, well, if the priests aren't going to, keep to the letter and the word of holy tradition, then they need to be called out, and so on and so forth. And I got to the point where and I was also, this was also the time where I was still more or less involved in more hard right circles, right? And I had made now since deleted comment on my former account that caught the ire of my godfather, who reported it to the local parish priests. And I basically had to sit down with two priests and the parish president and explain to them in front of my girlfriend for like 2 hours how I was not the second coming of Matthew Heimbach. I'm dead serious. And, if I was not convinced as I was about like the reality of like the divine and the demonic.
So they thought you were a neo-Nazi.
Yes. And it was bad. I have never been so steamed. I mean, I'm over it now. I understand what my godfather was doing was in good faith. It was, chastisement for the sake of my betterment, whatever. But again, if I was not as concerned as I am, or, if I wasn't as like sure about like the existence of the divine and the demonic and all this stuff of the transcendent, I think I would have apostatized, or I would have maybe even, I would have apostatized. But I got through it. But it did, the whole experience left me thinking something. And so in Orthodoxy in particular, it's very common that you have people who are on the right or who are radical traditionalists because they're disgusted with the modern world or everything that modernity implies. But this experience got me thinking, if the church is only willing to stand up against modernism when it's issues of maybe like abortion or, oh Lord, like prayer in schools or some other nonsense that I'm just kind of like, I think is more or less derived from like a kind of like a bourgeoisie ethos, right? Like if they're not willing to kind of like throw down the gauntlet and say no to like serious issues, then why should religion be like the thing we kind of rally around in the face of like subversion, right? And I mean, I say subversion, but like the bad things that are going on. Like I'm sure everyone who's watching this or who will watch it has like their own idea of the crisis that's facing the postmodern world, and they can interpret that however they wish, which is why I'm using like a kind of neutral term. But it got me thinking, and it's like, well, if the most hardline traditionalist denomination of Christianity is not willing to be the standard bearer for a true revolt against the modern world, then what good is it? What good is sacred tradition? What good is perennial wisdom in the face of all of this, right? And that turned me on to more political forms of thinking. That got me into the thinking of the political work of Carl Schmitt, who famous legal theorist, right, is studied. Actually, his works have been revived recently because they've caught the attention of the Chinese government and how they conduct their foreign policy.
What's his name?
Carl Schmitt.
Schmitt?
Yeah. He has the infamous reputation of being the chief legal theorist of the Third Reich, but
Right.
he kind of falls into
another Nazi.
Yeah, but it's like he kind of falls into the same category as like a Martin Heidegger, where it's like they kind of went along with it because if they didn't, well, you get thrown in the naughty camps, or you lose your job and your credibility, right? So if they wanted to keep their academic status as university professors, then you kind of had to toe the party line, so to speak. But still, for whatever sins Carl might have committed, his works are without a doubt brilliant. In fact, the concept of the political alone, I think, is the masterwork of all political science, and I would swear by that. It's less than 100 pages long, and I think no other book on political science or political theory has come close to
the concept of the political.
Yeah, it's a work of pure genius in my. But getting into leaving behind religionism, if you want to call it that. Like, and I say like religionism as kind of like the devotional aspect of a spiritual tradition, and getting into the more like, okay, well, if traditionalism isn't the answer, what is? And it eventually set me on this long course, which I'm still on. I'm still traveling. Of, well, if the postmodern world isn't going, or if modernity in itself is changing and it's not going away, if it's just going to mutate into something different, wouldn't it be better for people who are on the right or who are part of dissident circles more generally to kind of work with the trends that are coming than be reactionaries in the worst sense of the word, to be mere anachronists or archaists and just say, oh, well, we just got to defend the classics against these mean old postmodern feminist deconstructionist goobers, right? And that's what I was kind of getting at. And that got me into metamodernism, right? As a kind of who I was introduced, again, it goes without saying, by our mutual associate. I call him my bald Punjabi prince, Kashif Vikas, who got me into metamodernism. And coincidentally, and not a lot of people know this, that Kashif was also the figure who introduced Keith Woods, the Irish video blogger for the dissident right, into metamodernism, which he's since distanced himself, because I guess he thought it was too left-leaning, which it is. It is almost exclusively a left.
What's the guy's name?
Oh, Keith Woods.
Keith Woods.
Yes, very popular video blogger on YouTube. Young man. He's a very young man. I think he's about 20 or 21, but very sharp. And me and Keith, you know, despite our generation gap, we're kind of coming from a similar pattern. Like, we're both nationalists in a sense. I mean, and we're both anti-capitalist, right? Which it's really funny. Like, there are, but this is my point, is that there were people who were on the right who were anti-capitalist who weren't just apologists for, like, you know, the market, right? It disgusted me to no end, right? How you had people on the right who were still obsessed with, like, the Austrian school and all of this stuff. And it's like, you know, these same people, right, are using, you know, the power of capital to destroy your communities. You do realize that. They don't care about you. They only care about how much money they can make off of you, right? But it's like you have this assumption, which is taken up by libertarians exclusively, like government bad, market good, which I think is a false dichotomy, because look, the existence of the market predates the existence of capital, right? When I say, oh, I am anti-capitalist, I'm not saying I'm anti-free market or markets, right? The market is a primordial thing. It's ancient. But capital only really goes back to the market revolution and the rise of industrial society. So there's a disconnect there. And I feel like getting pigeonholed into this kind of false dichotomy of, well, that just means you're a big government statist who wants welfare money off my back, Jack. Like, that doesn't hold up. I'm sorry. It just doesn't hold up to reality.
Let me ask you a question. You mentioned before the libertarian to alt-right pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say more about that?
Sure. So, prior to, so the alt-right had actually been around as a kind of like nebulous, oh Lord, what is the word I'm looking for? As kind of like a nebulous backdoor forum for all of these different ideas. It just hadn't taken on the political nature that it had in 2016. So the alt-right was in existence back when the Ron Paul thing had taken off in 2012. It was just in the background, and no one was really thinking about it. But the Ron Paul movement gave energy to people who would be dissidents, people who would actually end up being white nationalists, who thought, okay, the problem is big government, and just to get government off our backs and to be more free and adhere to the principles of the Constitution and all this stuff, which manifested itself in, I call it boomer nationalism, but it's known as the Tea Party, right? Right. So
boomer nationalism.
Yes. But yeah, you had like the Ron Paul movement, you had the Tea Party back during the Obama years. You had a strong libertarian current. That's what I'm trying to get at. But all of that went down the tubes, I think, back when Trump became a phenomenon. And Trumpism really kind of brought populism back into the American consciousness in a way that just didn't exist before. And you had these legions of people who had been libertarians, either becoming national populists or white nationalists or ethno-nationalists or some kind of dissident, like some kind of hard dissident. And that really set the stage for the alt-right's ascendancy back before it kind of devolved into vulgar National Socialism and imploded in the aftermath of Charlottesville. right? I mean, it's almost impossible, I think, to speak of the alt-right as a movement after Charlottesville.
Coherent
And
movement, yeah.
So, and you had groups like propertarianism, who I think I would argue this, like not everyone's going to agree with this, but I would argue that you had groups like propertarianism and take up that kind of, they would never admit this, but they took up the classical liberal mantle, I would say. It's basically, they wanted to kind of, combine anarcho-capitalism with Ragnar Redbeard. It's like, well, I make a whole bunch of money, and so that means I'm going to be like an aristocrat in the future, right? It was really like, my critique of propertarianism was like, it's literally just a cool kids club for software programmers and computer engineers who thought they were going to be the barons, dukes, and earls after liberalism goes the way of the dodo, right?
Running a society algorithmically.
Yes, that was my problem with it. Like, Keith Woods had the accurate, like, he called the propertarian movement codified autism, which to this day I don't think there has been a better label for.
Codified autism.
Yes. But, propertarianism did not emerge out of a vacuum. It already, and a lot of people may or may not know this, but alongside the alt-right, and I guess it existed kind of within it as well, was a movement known as neo-reaction, which was founded by some, again, software programmers, Mencius Moldbug, the pen name of Curtis Yarvin, and Nick Land. And it was also like this attempt where it's like, well, we're going to be kind of reactionary. We want to go beyond the Enlightenment. In fact, they used the name for their movement was the Dark Enlightenment, right? But informally, it's known as the neo-reactionary. And this is just my theory, right? It's like, I think the people, like after Charlottesville, the people who, and again, neo-reaction was not a numerous movement. It was more of like a think tank, an informal think tank, much in the way that, the current, I guess you could call the meta-right, the movement that I'm a part of, sort of operates. It's not like a kind of boots on the ground sort of thing. It was very limited to social media and internet blogs, but it was pumping out a lot of interesting ideas.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of these ideas were just, defenses for classical liberal. I would say classical liberalism, but they would say maybe the free market. Like, I got behind like their monarchism. I got behind maybe their return to traditional forms of spirituality, but this obsession with the market was something that always left a bad taste in my mouth. But again, like, to make a long story short, you had the libertarian to alt-right pipeline was never, it wasn't a straight thing, it was more like a network of pipes that sometimes maybe overlapped and crisscrossed with one another. And some movements like neo-reaction kind of branched off into propertarianism, and now that's kind of imploded. And now you have maybe the more like...
Why did that implode?
Oh, because I think Kurt Doolittle peed his pants or something. I don't know. Like, he
peed his pants, and he also told black guys they had big dicks and stuff like that.
Yeah, it was and this was the man who they thought was going to, like, I don't know, take them to Mars or something. Like, I don't know. Like,
super genius.
It's like, my biggest problem with, like, propertarianism was its emphasis. It's almost like they use the word reciprocity in the same way that libertarians would use the NAP, right? And it's like, well, guess what?
Right.
Yeah. How do you demand reciprocity from people who aren't willing to reciprocate? And the classical libertarian response, a lot of people like Hans Hermann Hoppe, would be, oh, you just physically remove them. Well, what if they come back with bigger numbers than you, and you're the one being physically removed? How does that play into your little every man a micronation kind of thing? Like, it just
is weird.
Yeah,
Every man, judge, jury, and executioner.
that's essentially what that's their idea of freedom. But to me, it's like, I've always believed that being part of a community or being part of a nation or a province or having a history, like being deeply connected to, a spot of earth, right? Like that's like, it's, a common phrase on the right was blood and soil. And however politicized that phrase might have become in the wake of Charlottesville, I still feel like it's a very powerful, or it conjures up a very powerful image, right? Like you can't just remove people from the land that their ancestors are buried. Like that's my problem with this kind of, well, if you want to make it in life, you got to leave, your small bumpkin town where, everyone who, like your grandparents, your great grandparents are buried, and go to like a soulless city and make oodles of money in a call center somewhere. And it's like, no, like that's soulless, that's diabolical. Like, no, like that's not the way forward. That's evil. Like, to me, and I think Tucker Carlson actually brought up this point to Ben Shapiro, like this very point when Ben Shapiro was like, trying to defend like the markets, like, well, don't you know what you're saying kind of sounds like socialism? And it's like, so what? Like the market only works when, like, what was it? He had like this saying. It was like, stop judging economic success on how much money people in Wall Street are making or whether the stock market's up.
Right.
Judge economic success by whether your children will be able to afford a home and raise children of themselves. And that, that right there.
Tucker has taken a really strong anti-capitalist turn.
It's the oh God, what did Vaush call it? Or it was the Natsball vortex, I think he called it. Are you familiar with the Natsball gang?
No.
Okay. Well, so Natsball, like it was an internet meme. It stands for National Bolshevism, right? So basically, there's a small political party in like Russia, I think maybe even in Ukraine, where they're avowed Bolsheviks, right? But they're nationalist Bolsheviks. And so people, I know it's weird. It's like a kind of like right-wing socialism.
Yeah.
And it became kind of like a meme ideology where people who were right-wing but anti-capitalist would comment on like libertarian pages and just type like Natsball gang in all letters, like in all capital letters.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now it's like this thing where, okay, like you have people like Tucker Carlson, and I think even Lauren Southern has come out. Although I think she's a grifter, to be honest. I don't trust anything she says. But yeah, it's what we're seeing is a kind of loss of faith in free market economics, and I think that's a good thing for the right, to be honest.
Yeah, I just interviewed Josh Leonard from the Post Progressive Project, and I asked him what right-wing views he integrates, and he starts talking about the value of the free market. And I was like, well, hold on a second. That may have been, more of a right-wing talking point 10 years ago, but now things are trending anti-market, which is interesting. It sort of implies a shift on the right to more green or postmodern views.
Yes. Yeah,
which is where you originated from.
Yes. Like I got into the meta right, which again, it's kind of catching on in consciousness. It's not a big thing. Admittedly, the meta right as it stands now is more of like a gaggle of writers and theorists online who are kind of trying to come up with a form of right-wing political theory or political praxis that doesn't fall into like these more, let's call them blue or amber ways of thinking, right? And I know that strikes people like, well, what do you mean? Isn't the whole rights thing to be a bunch of like nostalgics, idolizing like the Middle Ages or the Viking era. And it's like, well, where is that set in stone? Right? Like, why can't we have a kind of like, I consider myself to be like maybe post-reactionary, right? Because think about it. What is it that the right was reacting to? It was the Jacobin revolution. It was the forms of liberalism that emerged in early colonial America. But now, like, look, like, here's the thing, like, modernity, this is how, like, I would define modernity, right? So when a rightist says revolt against the modern world, well, what does that mean? What exactly is the modern world they're revolting against? And I've kind of come up with a little rubric trying to break it down, right? We can define modernity more or less as the triumph of political ideology over religious tradition, right? We can define modernity as the domination of rationalism and epistemology over metaphysics, right? We can define modernity as the victory of the nation state, you know, the post-Westphalian nation state over the more, the feudal empires of, like, you know, the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, what existed, or, you know, up till the modern century, you know, you had Austria-Hungary, right? Like, these kinds of dynastic realms, which you had multiple ethnic groups that weren't, like, it wasn't just this people, this state, right? You had a political system where at the top was a monarch who embodied a overriding religious belief about the world, right? And this, you know, this adherence to tradition, you know, the divine right of kings, you know, that superseded all national distinctions or boundaries. But that doesn't exist anymore. That kind of metaphysical thinking of the divine right of kings or mandate of heaven, you can't explain that, right? And I'm someone who still is a monarchist, albeit, like, tragically, right? Because my belief in metaphysics tells me that I think monarchy is probably the best and most natural form of government for human beings. But if I'm being realistic, like, look, republicanism is here to stay. Like, republicanism isn't going away. So the quest now is to kind of like, okay, well, maybe we can have a kind of post-liberal republicanism. What that will look like, I don't know. I couldn't say. I think we're still in the process of kind of charting a new course in these very murky waters of the early 21st century.
Gotcha. So, so how would you define right, like postmodern right?
Okay. Do you want the easy definition, or do you want the long definition?
Let's start with the easy one.
So I would define it simply as green social nationalism.
Green social nationalism.
But green as in, like, economic. I mean, I'm sorry. Green as in, like,
environmental.
Yes, there you go. But hey, if you also want to throw, like, the postmodern aspect into there, that also works too. I would also define it as a reconciliation. So in metamodernism, it's very cliche almost to speak of oscillation as a term. Metamodernism is defined by the thinkers Vermeulen and van der Aken, the architectural theorists, who released the Metamodernist, it was Luke Turner who wrote the Metamodernist Manifesto. It was van der Aken and Vermeulen who had put out their notes on metamodernism. And they defined metamodernism as kind of like this oscillation between the poles of modernism, the belief in progress, the goodness of human nature, and postmodernism as kind of the skeptical skepticism within the power structures, which modernity and in the value memes before it kind of reinforced, right? But I would define right metamodernism or right postmodernism as kind of an oscillation between radical traditionalism and futurism, right? Yeah, so it's gonna like not all like look, the pendulum is not gonna just stop in one place. It's gonna keep moving. You might have people who are further on the traditionalist side. You might have people on the more futurist side. Like for example, I don't know if you're aware of a writer by the name of Jason Reza Georgiani. And Georgiani is
hard futurism.
Yes. So Georgiani is the founder of an ideological system called Prometheism, which it's really, please take this with a grain of salt. Like Prometheism, from what I understand, is basically this weird Kool-Aid cult / political ideology where it's like we have to kind of become like transhuman badasses because there's going to be like an invasion of like Nordic alien space Nazis or something that are going to come to. I know it's really weird. It's really weird. Basically, what you need
reasonable to me.
Okay. But what you need to know is that Georgiani is a hard futurist. Like he's on the right, but he completely rejects a belief in maybe not the mystical, but he's very, anti-Christian, or he would say Abrahamic, right? He's against like what we would call maybe like blue or amber ways of thinking. He is hard futurist, right? He basically says we're going to become transhuman because it's inherent to the survival of, the West or something. Or, I mean, he's also an Iranian irredentist, so he probably would identify more with Iranian culture than he would with Western culture. It's really weird, but look him up if you have a chance. He's an interesting guy. He's just kind of gone off the deep end. But again, like that's what I'm talking about. Like on one end you have Jason Reza Georgiani, on the other hand you have Ted Kaczynski, and it's like this pendulum between the two, right? And the meta right is kind of like, well, we're going to chart out like a third course between all of this going forward. But yeah, I mean, and I would say with regards to that, the working definition that I've used to kind of define the meta right is it is a post-reactionary, archaeo-futuristic, and I'm going to go back to that term in a bit. It is a post-reactionary, archaeo-futurist form of revolutionary conservatism that embraces aspects of perennial philosophy, deep ecology, and demographic realism. That has been the working definition that I've used. Okay. And I want to go back to this term archaeo-futurism because I think you can't speak of meta-right ideas without going back to a specific book put out by another writer, Guillaume Faye, who himself was part of the French New Right, which was kind of like a circle of intellectual writers and thinkers who were trying to go beyond, like, they were essentially the precursors to what we're trying to do now, right? You had it was mostly two guys, but, they had like a circle of other writers, right? It was Alain de Benoit and Guillaume Faye, who were trying to, they were basically the original green or postmodern right, like the original guys. They kind of rejected traditional Catholicism or traditional Christianity. They were very pagan in their ways of thinking. In fact, back when I was a pagan, I poured myself over Alain de Benoit's book on being a pagan. Like he literally wrote the book on being a pagan. So the thing about the New Right was they were intensely pan-European, they were anti-American, they were neo-pagan, and they were also, although they would not admit this themselves, incredibly postmodern. And along that, and in a similar vein, you had, the big cheese himself, Alexander Dugin, who was kind of writing parallel to the new right with his fourth political theory.
Right.
I mean, I guess, like, I feel like I'm being bold because I feel like maybe your audience is more familiar with, like, Ken Wilber, maybe Hansi Freinock, not so much Alexander Dugin or Alain de Benoit.
There's some awareness of Dugin.
Okay, yes, he's the more well known out of all of them. But yeah, it's like you had the French New Right, you had the fourth political theory, and they were the first attempts to kind of have like a postmodern right that wasn't just going back to like like traditional Catholicism or whatever, because that was the mainstay, right? Like when people thought like conservatism, they thought like, oh, maybe Roger Scruton, maybe Pat Buchanan. I don't know. Maybe if you want to go even deeper, you have like the counter-revolutionary thinkers such as Donoso Cortez, Nicolas Gomez de Villa, and who was the famous one? I know Edmund Burke was in there as well, but there was a French writer who was like the arch conservative. Oh Lord, he was the guy who defended the royalists against the French revolutionaries, right? I'm embarrassed, honestly, that I forgot his name because he's. But anyway, it'll probably come back to me. But anyway, it wasn't falling back into these kind of like Christian democratic or monarchist, let's call it that. It wasn't falling back into the whole traditional conservative, monarchist, maybe distributist or pro-free market, or capitalist sympathetic movements, right? Certainly it wasn't descending back into Reaganism. That's for sure. And what I feel like people in the meta right are trying to do is kind of build on the legacy of these postmodern right movements for something that could be postmodern, or if we're going to use the word metamodern, right? And I want to just make it clear that I feel like I am the thorn, and like I might as well be the thorn in the side of Hansi Freinock, right? Like if you look at his articles in Metamoderna, you find that the meta right has a special place of antipathy in his writings, because again, metamodernism originally began as a form of cultural criticism and architectural theory, but it was Hansi who added up. I would contest the term political, but he would say political dimension. When he
Political dementia?
I'm sorry. He would no. He added a political dimension to it.
Okay.
My bad.
Got it.
No, I don't think he's demented. I hope not. He's certainly much more of an optimist than I am. But anyway, but no. So I think Hansi put out the Listening Society back in 2015, and it's essentially like a left libertarian experiment with. Okay, so what is the solution that comes after liberalism, right? Because Hansi himself is not like, he's a liberal, but he's not like a liberal in the sense of like neo-lib kind of liberalism. And I kind of use the term, like I used the term green social nationalist before as a kind of like tongue-in-cheek reference to Hansi's experiment, which he describes as being green social liberalism, right? So basically, like you could say a whole bunch of things about the Listening Society. I think the book itself is like 400 to 600 pages, but I'm going to sum that up. It's basically an advocation for social democracy 2.0. That's it. Like that is basically his plan. And I've been very skeptical of that plan because I think, well, I mean, okay, yeah, liberal democracy is kind of going down the tubes, but so is social democracy, right? It's like I tend to think, having a welfare state is a good thing, but the welfare state in its current form is kind of like being overburdened. Like the welfare state presupposes one, a homogenous population that isn't at each other's throats, and we're already seeing a collapse of that in Sweden, which is well, let me try to be generous. It is the sexual assault capital of Europe, as it stands. So, I mean, if social democracy and liberal democracy aren't the answer, well, then what is? And I think it's a kind of new social nationalism. I think it's a real return to roots that isn't rooted in this kind of nostalgism for the past. Although, I mean, look, it's always good to pay homage to who we are and where we came from. I'm not contesting that. Like, I feel like identity, having an identity is a good thing, no matter who you are. I mean, look, it doesn't matter if you're a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or a Maasai warrior in the highlands of Kenya. You know, we all come from somewhere. We all dream in our own languages. Like, that's what I'm getting to. Like, identity is a good thing, but I also understand that moving people around and resettling them creates antagonisms. And I think that needs to be addressed. Generally, I'm against whatever, rather I should say, I'm for whatever reduces human suffering in whatever way. I'm for whatever reduces human suffering. And I think that having two different groups of peoples living cheek and jowl, or even more than that, having different groups of peoples who have nothing in common with one another, again, living cheek and jowl next to each other, creates a recipe for conflict. And look, I've seen this in person. Like, one of my coworkers is an Iraqi, right? And he has seen firsthand the devastation that the Sunni Shia conflicts have caused, right? And these are people who are they speak the same language. They're part of the same nation. Although, let's be fair, I mean, Iraq as an independent state is fairly young. But, you know, they have, I mean, if these types of antagonisms, I think, you know, these different, I'm trying to gather my thoughts. If you have like different tribes, different groups of people, like, who have historically lived by each other for centuries, like we see maybe the Middle East or in sub-Saharan Africa, and they can't get along despite living next to each other for the dawn of time, how are you going to reconcile this in the 21st century by just moving different peoples via airplanes and settling them next to each other? And this was a conversation I had with Brent Cooper. I don't know if you ever had him on but this was years ago, or maybe a year or two ago, and we talked about this. And, you know, Brent made the argument, like, well, hey, look, like, we're if you have like a college, a university, and if you go to that university, there are going to be people of diverse ethnic backgrounds there. And they're all going to kind of socialize and get along and work together and study together. And I made the comment, well, look, Brent, what happens when they go home? You know, they're going to go home and they're going to speak their own languages. They're going to have dinner with their own local foods. And maybe on the weekend, they'll get up and go to whatever temple or church they have and pray to whatever specific gods are or belong to their culture. It's easy to think that multiculturalism works on the surface because, well, we have a kind of superstructure in place that kind of conceals it's almost like a faux civic religion, I would say. It's like, okay, we pay lip service to maybe one language, one set of values, right? But then afterwards, when, you know, when the bonfire is over, when we stop singing Kumbaya and passing around the bomb.
Yeah, they leave the modernity camp and
yes, and they go back to what they know, right? That's what I'm kind of getting at.
And, well, yeah, because a lot of this stuff like spiral dynamics and such, it's describing the lower left, the collective values that we share, and the collective worldview. And yeah, I can participate in an orange world today and go home to my amber family, and then I'm participating in that.
Exactly, yes. But I would also say this is what makes this is the grave mistake of people who really sincerely believe in spiral dynamics, or rather the universalism that it kind of presupposes. Spiral dynamics presupposes modern Western liberal values as getting better or improving. But these values are only found in Europe and European or European descended societies, right? Like, we would be talking a whole different language, like both figuratively and literally, if, say, perhaps, somehow, if Islam had achieved the prominence that the West had during the Age of Discovery, right? We would be, you and I might be, talking about like certain passages in the Quran or the Hadith or something like that, and like, and not about like ooga booga, like, gender identity and feminism, and like, and trying to be all huggy, lovey-dovey, and just, like, it presupposes like all of these notions, right? Or if again, like, if our societies were more informed by the values of East Asia, right? If Confucianism had somehow achieved the prominence that the Enlightenment had, a lot of what a lot of our thought would be influenced by, maybe, Taoist cosmology, and certainly the Confucian conception of filial piety, right? And our obligations in the social arena. So it's like, what makes these values that we assume to be universal? Just because the West has had a dominance, over everyone else in terms of its ways of thinking. Not everyone accepts the tenets or the discoveries of the scientific revolution or the values of the Enlightenment. I don't. Like, I think we kind of need we need a dark Enlightenment 2.0. We need to think, well, hey, if the values of the first Enlightenment, it were liberalism and rationalism and humanism, maybe we need another Enlightenment to kind of get us through the crisis. And Lord, believe me, I don't have any hope that the 21st century is going to be like this era where we all achieve, what was it? What was like turquoise or coral mega mind consciousness, and we're all going to be like ascended yogic supermen who just subsist off of like green tea, and
air.
Yeah, it's like, do these people really think that? Like, I don't know. Like,
no, we're not all going to be. There's going to be a few turquoise Ubermenschen who establish, a Turquoise Reich.
Yes, like it'll be the in the death camps of tolerance or something, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's how I imagine. Like, no, I'm dead serious. Like, that is what's going to happen. Like, I'm convinced about it. Like, but I don't know. Like, the future hasn't been decided, right? There's lots of things that can happen, and I'm just kind of focused on trying to maybe catch the tail end of like the shadow of what the future holds, right? I think it's really important to kind of like look at the trends and not kind of be stuck in like a certain mindset. Like, for instance, like, look, I've abandoned essentially like all of my ideological presumptions about the world, right? And once you do that, like, maybe that also goes back to my metaphysics too. I don't know, like, Marshall, like, I feel myself stuck. Like, I'll get really upset with like the failures of my own specific religious tradition, right? Like, I'll feel like, oh, orthodoxy it'll only become political if it's about, abortion rights, but not about like things that I also find of dire importance, such as climate change, right? I feel like I'm a firm believer in like anthropocentric climate change, right? And that matters to me. And it's like a lot of these traditionalist groups, they believe like, oh, well, the planet's just always going to be there. Okay, yeah, maybe, but like, how is, what effect is that going to have on human civilization? Again, like I need to stress, like I'm generally for whatever abolishes the possibility of human suffering, right? And I don't want to
Which is a very green ethos.
I mean, yeah, like I have these moments where maybe I feel a little bit more blue or amber, and then I think, well, big picture, like we need to be thinking, like what?
Yeah, it seems like you started out in this green place, and you're sort of like grasping for some kind of integral or meta modern solution. It's like you've dabbled in all the different flavors of postmodern right wing thought and found them all limited in various ways. And so you're just sort of like fumbling around in the dark, like trying to find where the things are going, you know, what the future is, and participating in that.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like, because that's what matters to me. It's not like, look, I mean, as much as I am a student of history, the past is in the past. And I'm not saying like the struggle isn't for antiquity, right? The struggle is for the future, right? That's like, that is what matters. Like, what kind of future are we going to have? Like, our victory, again, however you want to define it, like I'm assuming, the people who watch this channel, they know something's wrong. They know that, post-industrial civilization has kind of gone askew, that something is deeply, deeply wrong. And, speaking to like whatever dissidents may be out there, or people who are countercultural types, I don't know. Our victory lies in, winning the future, right? Like, what kind of future that might be, I don't know. I can't say, but that's where it's going to, like, it's not just going to be like, okay, us in this moment. We need to be thinking about like what type of world our descendants are going to inherit. I mean, we're not just here to, like, we're not just here to, like defend like a certain dogma, right? And I'm speaking more in terms of like, my fellow co-religionists, right? Like, okay, like, do we need to have all these certain like orthodox debates? Like, oh, we need to debate like Protestantism or these Muslims or these Catholics. Like, okay, that's all very good and interesting, but is that what matters right now? Like, I'm into that stuff. Like, I watch Jay Dyer occasionally, but I also like, I've read like freaking On the Incarnation and On the Unity of Christ, like these truly esoteric Christological tomes, right? Sometimes more than once. But is that what we need right now in this moment? No, we need a kind of like meta theory, maybe, that's going to get us from where we are now to a future that hopefully is not in flames. I mean, it's looking a little less.
Yeah,
I don't know. Like,
so you once made a comment about orange was a mistake. It was an aberration, and we just skipped from like amber to green. And I wonder how you feel about that now.
That was a while back. Yeah.
Sure.
No.
I'm wondering if you now have you're starting to integrate the merits of orange and not just this sort of orange is here to stay and we can't really do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that comment. I think that was a lot of my anti-modernism speaking. I really just, I want to say like that may have been premature because.
Sure, but I'm just wondering now, like, have you come to embrace modernity?
Yes, and I know that's like, I know if my fellow Orthodox friends saw that, they would be horrified, but it's like, look, I mean, again, like I said earlier, there's no putting Cromwell and Westphalia back in the box. There's no undoing the Enlightenment. You can't just like it's that famous phrase. It's that famous quote, right? When there was this journalist who interviewed. It was a president of China. I think it was Xi Jinping, and he asked him, "What are your thoughts on the French Revolution?" And his famous reply was, "It's too early to tell." Right. And that's kind of how I feel like we're still kind of living in with the presuppositions of modernity, right? Despite like all of postmodernism's attempt to kind of like undo the assumptions associated with modernism. But I think it's because like someone like myself, and I think this is especially true after I've reread actually the writing of Carl Schmitt. And so postmodernity or postmodernism was really concerned about power structures. And the political theory of Carl Schmitt simply but effectively defines the essence of the political as the ability to make a distinction between friend and enemy, right? And I think that, I mean, he was writing in the 40s or maybe the 20s actually, but I feel like maybe I have a little bit too much green in me, right? Maybe I'm too much of a postmodern myself. Like I'm still concerned with all these power structures, and maybe I'm skeptical of orange or modernities or modernism's faith in human progress. Like I'm very skeptical of the idea of progress, right? In fact, if I'm being honest, Marshall, like I honestly, I've always rejected the idea of progress, both intellectually and philosophically, because what does the idea of progress imply, right? It's like I call it the iPhone mentality. It's like everything's going to get better. Everything's just going to keep getting better. It's like, I don't know if you ever seen this Pixar movie, WALL-E, right? But anyway, what was the thing in WALL-E, right? You know, humans kind of off-boarded the planet, and now they're in this spaceship where they're all just like these overweight, like morbidly obese.
That's progress.
Yeah, that is the end goal. That is the fat people in the hover chairs that is the end of history. That is the culmination of it is. If you have everything you want, like if you have like the VR headset in front of you and like more disgusting and grotesque types of junk food at your side, and you're just kind of floating around
with the masturbation machine.
Yes, like that's what it is. Like this is why I don't believe I'm not
plugged into the metaverse.
Exactly. Like, and I do think that has so much. The idea of the metaverse, I think, has repercussions that we're not even able to grasp yet. Like I was thinking about this the other day. There was this. Oh God. So there was this anime I had watched decades ago, right? And it was kind of like Highlander in a way. It was about this chick who was immortal. She was like an immortal being, and it went through like different decades, right? And almost prophetically, granted, I had watched this in 2008. It was in 2025. You had like this boom, like VR was becoming virtually accessible or easily accessible. I'm sorry. And so much so that there was a national health crisis of young men dropping out of society because they were addicted to their VR headsets. Like you had like literally like these young men who were just like sitting like homeless bums on like the street or outside of buildings, just kind of addicted to like their VR headsets or whatever, and they would just like beg for change to keep the thing going, right? And I feel like that is that is in store for us. Like I firmly believe that is a stark possibility. But I don't know, like it's like whenever I worry about the future, something else has already happened, right? And I got to worry about that too.
Maybe the answer is not to worry about the future.
Yeah, you know, I mean, Albert
but
Einstein
to take steps right now towards whatever's optimization for you.
True. I mean, and Albert Einstein had that quote where he was like, you know, I don't worry about the future, it comes soon enough, right? I mean, maybe I need to start incorporating that into my life. But I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm generally like pro technology. Like, I'm not a anarcho primitivist or Kaczynskiite or any of these things, because I just feel like, like, yeah, I like the internet. I like Amazon. I mean, maybe not Jeff Bezos, but I like the convenience that, post-industrial society can offer. And I think that our ability to interact with people across the world, like, you and I may be living in different states, but we're able to speak, maybe not face to face, but I can clearly see you, right? I mean, maybe you're in the metaverse right now, right? I also got to say, I love that synthwave backdrop you have going. Like, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of vaporwave, synthwave, future funk. Like,
I know. I like it too. I was trying to understand, like, where did this come from? Like, there was this resurgence of synthwave aesthetics on the right. What the hell is that about?
It's the death of the future. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with a left-wing author by the name of Mark Fisher, but he's someone I've picked up, and I think a few right-wing people are starting to look into. So Mark Fisher was a left-wing cultural critic, and he wrote about what was called hauntology. And
Hauntology, yeah.
Yeah, specifically like the death of the future, and how, like, what he meant by that, right, was that all of our cultural trends have basically been a rehashing of previous trends from the last 3 decades, right? It's like we're stuck at this point where we cannot imagine a future that's different than what has already been conceived in the past. It's just like, it really is like this end of history scenario, right? Where we at the end of history are trying to imagine the future from the lens of what people in previous decades and generations imagined it to be, right? And that's informing our music, that's informing our movies. Like, I remember there's a movie out there called Retro Player One, right?
Ready Player One?
Yeah, there you go. No, Retro Player One was the name of a music channel that puts out this type of music. My bad. Yeah, Ready Player One. Gosh, I think there was another one. Anyway, but yeah, it's like me and Alex and another mutual of ours, Clifton Knox. We had a podcast actually about this very thing. Went on for like 3 hours, but we talked about, like, the death of the future, hauntology, and it really is like a very millennial thing, right? Where it's like, like someone my age, like I'm 30 right now, but I grew up in the 90s, right? I grew up in the .com boom. And at that time, I was being told, and it looked like the sky was the limit. You had all of these cool gadgets coming out, not just in the domestic market, but from overseas, right? And you had Pokemon, and you had all of these, sales at Sears or Radio Shack or something. Like, you had all of this cool stuff, and it looked like things were going to get better. And then what happened? The .com bubble burst and the Twin Towers fell, right? And we've been living in this kind of, the postmodern hellscape ever since. Like, it's like, and now we can't even imagine a future of our own. We have to go back to like these previous forms, these previous modes of cultural production, of ways of thinking, right? That's why everyone's going back to the 80s, because it was like this last time, right, where America as a unified country could get together and listen to the same sorts of music, enjoy the same movies, right? It was the generation or the decade of Top Gun. It was the decade of Michael Jackson and Madonna, and everyone was listening to it, right? The 80s was this time where no matter who you were or, what you looked like, you were all experiencing the same thing. And everyone just wanted to have a good time and drink Crystal Pepsi and, I don't know, like, go to the roller rink with your gal. It was like, that's what I feel like it's getting at. It's like, we can't escape, like, the thing about hauntology or retroculture or the death of the future is acknowledging, and this is something I'm very interested in. I mean, I think it's why I like vaporwave so much, because it appeals to this thing. Like, I mean, there's a subgenre of vaporwave called mallsoft, right? And I remember going to the malls as a child and just being like bewildered by all the indoor palm trees and the indoor pools. And I thought, this is the coolest thing ever. And I could go to like the store that had all the retro games, like the old NES games that my older brother, who was born in like the 80s, enjoyed, right? And I thought, like, man, it's not going to get better than this, right? And I guess it didn't, because, like, I mean, has anything really improved? I mean, maybe our medical science, but as a culture, like, has our culture, has our way of like imagining a future independent of the tropes of the past, has that happened? No. And I don't know, like, that's what I'm trying to kind of get to. Like, we could kind of use the aesthetics of the past to kind of propel us towards a future that is original, right? And I think you find that a lot in meta right circles, right? Like, you can't speak of the meta right without also kind of getting into its ontology. And I mentioned this in the podcast I did with Alex, right? What separates the meta right from mere reactionaries or traditionalists, right, is this idea, okay, so the traditionalist or the reactionary is pining for a past that no longer exists. Maybe it didn't exist. Maybe it's mythic. Someone like myself, and I feel like people who are getting into the meta right, especially if they're our age, they're nostalgic for a future that never happened. They're orphans for a future that they were promised by their parents, by their teachers, and it never materialized. They were thinking they were going to inherit a world that was far better than the one they grew up with. And it never happened. Now they're stuck working at, now they're baristas at Starbucks. They're working at Lowe's or something. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to hurt. I don't want to, like, look, if you're working an honest job, like, I respect you. But what I'm trying
wasn't the future they were promised.
Yes, it wasn't the future they were promised. Like, it's 2021 and there are still no, like, flying cars, for instance, right? Like, where are the flying cars?
Another few years.
Yeah. Maybe Elon Musk will release a model. I don't know. Like, who knows? But yeah, that's just, there's so many things. I'm sorry?
Yeah, hauntology.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read this. It says, it's the return or persistence of elements from the past as in the manner of a ghost.
Mm-hmm.
Is introduced by French philosopher Jacques Derrida in his 1993 book Spectres of Marx. Basically, that it was the observation that Marxism kept haunting Western society from beyond the grave, which is true.
Yeah, that's still true. Like I have, like, and I think this is more of like a boomer / Gen X thing. Like, I have one of the greatest errors I think the alt-right made, and this is still true, I think, with people who are on the right, who are Gen Xers, is they want to ascribe all of the subversive elements that have been kind of undermining Western culture to this notion of cultural Marxism, right? But is Marxism, like, is it really a force to be reckoned with anymore? I mean, the Soviet Union has collapsed. Like, it's ceased to exist for like 2 decades now. And all the remaining Marxist Leninist regimes, well, one, China and Vietnam have embraced very authoritarian forms of market capitalism. Cuba, Laos, and North Korea are really the only 3 states that have command economies. And I'm thinking, like, is it Marxism that's been undermining Western culture, or is it liberalism, or specifically neoliberalism? Like, I think a lot of our economic problems kind of go back to like the Bretton Woods system of finance. So I don't know if you guys know about the Bretton Woods system, but basically it was like during the midpoint of World War II, all these bankers and economic theorists got together. I think they were from the US and Britain, and they met in a little town called Bretton Woods. And they basically charted out like what the post-war economic system was going to look like. And our whole system of international finance to banking is based on that system. I mean, it's not something that I think gets talked about a lot.
Countries promised that their central banks would maintain fixed exchange rates between their currencies and the dollar.
Yeah. It made every country on earth subservient to the US dollar, right? Yeah, I mean, that's not Marxism, folks. Like, that's capitalism. I'm sorry. Like, it's not, like, I understand, like, look, during like the great awakening of 2011, it was very trendy to bash like the deconstruction people, the postmoderns, the people who may have been culturally Marxist because they liked Marx or whatever, or because they were left-wing anti-capitalists. But it's like, look, the goofy blue-haired feminist or the fat acceptance person, those aren't the people who are undermining your societies. They're just goofballs. Like, it's really, like, subversion is not a bottom down. It's not a bottom up thing. It's a top down thing, right? It's like,
well, so this gets into like what Marxism, what cultural Marxism is. It's not so much anti-capitalist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I've never liked the term cultural Marxism, really, because one, I don't think the Frankfurt School ever had the influence that people thought it did. I really think if you want to say...
Well, I don't know. I mean, you've got Marcuse.
Sure, look...
Who was the father of the New Left.
Okay, true. That is true. But it's like, was anyone really reading Adorno or Benjamin? I get it. Marcuse was certainly, he is the founder of the New Left. But what thinkers were influencing leftist thought during this period? It wasn't the Frankfurt School. It was the French post-structuralist school, right? It was people like, again, Derrida, Baudrillard, Lyotard.
Foucault.
Yeah, Foucault. Oh, yeah, Foucault was a big one. It was these people who went on to influence academia.
Right, but they were really just like continuing the project of the Frankfurt School.
Were they? I mean, I don't know. I just feel like maybe if the Frankfurt School got things started, these were the guys who kind of hit the pedal to the metal and accelerated that. You know, these.
Yeah, I don't really think of the Frankfurt School as really the basis of cultural Marxism.
I don't. I feel
that
like
was more traditional Marxism. They were making anti-capitalist critiques, and they were doing the cultural turn. But I would say that took a lot longer for so you had Gramsci.
Okay, yes.
Cultural hegemony.
Yes.
And he was still a Marxist, but he was the one that was like, and there was interaction between Gramsci and Adorno, I believe, or Horkheimer or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was the one that really said, okay, capitalism maintains its sort of stronghold by control of the cultural institutions. And he identified 5 cultural institutions that need to be infiltrated, in a sense. And he said the church, law, education, media, and the family.
Okay.
So he was responsible for like the cultural turn. But then, there was a lot of different evolutions. So you can kind of, in modern, like, what some call cultural Marxism or identity Marxism, you can see the sort of Marxian template. The oppressor and oppressed structure, the overthrow, right, by the underclass, or, so it's like that. If you're looking at it from a ontological perspective, you can see the whole Marxian template, the turn from economics to culture, combined with some of the weapons, like the deconstructive weapons, from and Foucault's episteme.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, there's this evolution of thought, and you can, but like modern cultural Marxism is not really Marxism, but here it's not really traditional Marxism. But this is really interesting. If you compare like Bernie Sanders from his first run for president to his next run for president, there was a marked shift from like traditional socialism to identity politics. Like he really embraced the whole systemic racism or white supremacy critique.
Yeah. No.
So even he's like a hardcore traditional socialist, and even he, it only took a few years for him to make that shift.
Right. But I think that gets to my point, is like Marxism is essentially dead, or at least in the sense that we understand it. Like, look, and just a note, Gramsci is actually really thought well of in new right circles. Like Gramsci had, I think, a profound influence on Alain de Benoit and people in the new right. But again, so here's why I say that Marxism or conventional Marxism is kind of like it's a specter, right? I don't think it's possible to speak of Marxism outside of its dialectics on economics. Because if Marxism just becomes Marxism as applied to culture, we're speaking of something entirely different. And you see this in the left, right? Like if you read the works of, I think Baudrillard specifically, I'm probably butchering his name, but if you read
Baudrillard, I think.
Yeah. Simulacra and Simulation, I read that book and came away thinking like this could have been written by a conservative. Like he seems to have been like, just, I don't know. He seems to have lost faith in like the ability of Marxism to really be like an economic force, right? And it's almost like the left is becoming post-Marxian. But see, when you abandon Marx's critique on economics and you apply it to culture, what are you left with? I mean, you've already said it. It's identity politics. And left-wing identity politics, that's essentially social nationalism, right? So it's like, I'm kind of like a social nationalist, like from the right, And yeah, it's, I mean, that's where we're at. It's like, the haves and the have-not thing has just been applied to culture now. It's been applied to race,
right,
or ethnicity, or some
cultural
other
power.
Yeah, it really is that. It really is all about that. And that, I think that's just where we're at. And that's going to be a continuous thing where it's going to be the tribalization. And I really mean it. It's going to be like, we are going to be returning to a kind of tribalism. It's like, we're going to have like, the technology that we do now, but it's like the third worldization almost of the Northern Hemisphere, I want to say. Like, it would not shock me, and I hate to say this because I feel like I'm just the arch pessimist, but it would not shock me in like the next decade we have like car bombs going off in major American cities becoming a regular thing. It would not shock me. Or, maybe you'll have like radical groups. Maybe you'll have like Minutemen or Antifa types. Maybe not this. Maybe I'm going too exaggeration. Maybe we'll have like, what do you call them? Like the anti-aircraft batteries on the back of Toyotas? No. Maybe that's too much of a stretch. But what I'm trying to say is like things are not getting better, right? And we need a solution, which I think is going to take the form of a kind of national divorce, right? Where I really am strongly for that. Like, in my writing, I've been very critical of what I call the American federal empire, right? Where you have like different tribes of people in the United States, and they all are just kind of like forced to live with one another. And the only times we kind of put aside our differences is what? Like the Super Bowl, where we gather together to, drink beer and guzzle down corn syrup and yell at the TV screen. It's like, but that's like, it sounds silly, but that's the reality of the situation, right?
I hear you. So you live in Texas, right?
I do.
So you're hoping for secession?
I am. Granted, like Texas secessionism has assumed a very, like, maybe it's not Reaganite, but it's like, it's, very libertarian oriented, right? And yeah, like I'm very pro secession. I'm tired of living in this madhouse of a country, right? Maybe you have different thoughts on that. And I don't blame people who are attached to America as an ideal, but America doesn't exist anymore. It's just a marketplace. It's a strip mall stretching from sea to shining sea, right? It's not the country your grandparents had. It's not even the country your parents knew anymore. It's this horrible, like, oligarchic, corporate thing that is just diabolical down to its bare bones. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. And I'm saying this as someone like, like I wanted things to be different, man. Like I didn't grow up thinking like, hey, when I grow up, I want to be a right-wing extremist. Like, no, I grew up thinking like, I want like my ideal. And I want to preface this by saying that I'm not a civic nationalist, but I wish that civic nationalism could have worked. I wish we could have come together. I wish it could have been like a new 80s where we just come together to drink our cherry Pepsi and,
From
like,
Crystal to cherry Pepsi.
Well, they phase it out. So, but yeah, it's like where we just come together, listen to, the best lo-fi hits, the future funk radio, whatever. And we're all just jamming out, having a good time. It doesn't matter if you're black or white or Hispanic or whatever. We're all just chilling. We want to have a good time. We want to party. We're enjoying another boom economy, right? But that's not what's happening. Things they're getting worse. And I just don't think they're going to get better. I would like for them to get better. I just don't see it as a possibility. And I think with that in mind, national divorce has to be the only way out. Like, I don't know what form that's going to take. Maybe it'll be ethno-nationalism. Maybe it'll be bioregionalism. Maybe it'll be a kind of state-based secession where it's like red state, blue state. Like, there's a lot of possibilities that could happen. Maybe it'll be like, an indirect war on the red states by the blue states using their power through like the channels of the federal empire to kind of punish them for their I don't know, their attachment to the refusal to give up on historic America. I don't know what could happen. There's a plethora of scenarios.
You mentioned, so you defined meta right as including demographic realism.
Yes.
Why don't you tell me more what that means?
So it means that demographics are destiny, right? You get the country with the population that you have, right? It means that, Europeans build societies that look like Western civilizations. It means that wherever that, people who are of Chinese origin go, they build Chinatowns. It means that wherever you have a pocket of Latin Americans, it tends to look, feel like Latin America. It means that whenever you have African descended peoples come together as a community, they tend to look and feel like Africa, right? Civilizations or cultures or whatever, they produce, outcomes or societies that look and feel like their places of origin, right? There's a reason why, despite existing on the same island, the Dominican Republic and Haiti are drastically different. Haiti tends to look, feel like Africa, while the Dominican Republic more or less resembles a country that we would think of when we visit a Latin American country, right? This isn't to say that, it's not my place to say that one culture is better or worse than another, because I feel like if I were to say, like, if my measure of success is Eurocentric, then I think, oh, well, then for a country to be successful, they need to have a very developed economy. They need to have very developed infrastructure. They need to be producing and consuming all these goods, but there's nothing, what makes like a rural backwoods African village what makes it worse than like a metropolitan major city? Certainly the people in that village would, be more, I guess, in communion with their neighbors, with their families, with their local histories and culture. But it also means accepting that when you get different cultures, that civilizations, right, they are defined by the fault lines that exist between them. That's just, like, history is a slaughter bench. There's no easy way to put it. And whenever you have the fault lines of civilization, there's going to be earthquakes, right? That's just how it is. And it means like coming to terms with that. It means really accepting that, you could try to have a scenario where you have Western style, liberal, postmodern democracies existing alongside the Muslim world, maybe, right? But hey, we already had a situation like that maybe it wasn't a Western democracy. It was more maybe Orthodox, right? We saw this with the collapse of Yugoslavia, right? We had these Orthodox peoples, the Serbs, right? And they had a large minority population of Muslims in the form of Bosniaks. And we all know how that went, right? Like, I'm very skeptical of multiculturalism's praises. I feel like it tends to produce more conflict than it does compassion. And look, I get along well with people of a variety of ethnic backgrounds, right? Me and that Iraqi gentleman I just mentioned, we have a good time talking to each other. Although he's actually a liberal, so I'm shocked. Like, I've never met someone from the Middle East who wasn't. But
when they come over here, this country sort of selects for people who are more liberal.
It's interesting, right? He's also, what's funny is the way most right-wing people would think about the state of Israel, right? Their anti-Zionism. He honestly ascribes all of that to Iran, which maybe, the guy lived through the Iran-Iraq war, so I'm assuming that's probably why that is. I've never just met someone from the Middle East who thought that way. It's really interesting. Mostly because I attend an Arabic-speaking church. Well, I say Arabic-speaking. There are a lot of Levantine people who go there, right? It's an Antiochian parish. But yeah, it's not like, I personally have, like, I'm not like some avowed racist who just wants to shake my fist at, the POCs or something. It's like, oh, why don't you just speak English? Like, granted, I think English is the best language on earth because I'm just a chauvinist in that regard, right? It's the language of Chaucer. It's the language of Shakespeare, right? Like, I also find gendered languages to be incredibly silly. Like, like when I study Spanish, I'm thinking, well, what makes the table feminine? Why is the table feminine?
It's a good question.
I know, like I just never liked that about the Romance languages, but
there's got to be a reason for it.
Possibly. I mean, I don't know what that reason is.
They wouldn't just do it randomly.
Yeah, I just never understood that. Like, I don't know. Like, but that's what I'm getting at. It's like, yeah, every culture.
That's where you serve food.
I'm sorry. Oh yeah. Oh, that's very right. But yeah, that's what I'm getting at. It's like, look, like when I say I'm a demographic realist, it means that demography matters. Like, look, if you have a country, right, that was a previous that was made up of a certain group of people, and then all of a sudden a different group of people settle and begin to outnumber that group of people, it ceases to be that country, right? It ceases to become what it was and begins to be something else. That's just a matter of, history. Like if Texas, like look, we have a large Hispanic population in Texas. And if Texas, for whatever reason, through demographics or whatever, becomes like majority Hispanic, which I think it already is, and somehow Spanish becomes the lingua franca of Texas, well, even if it exists as part of the United States or as an independent republic, it may as well just be another part of the Latin American world at that point. I just don't see the benefit other than, liberals might say, well, think about all the ethnic food. And I remember Richard Spencer quoting that one Monty Python sketch where he said, well, hey, now that we have the recipes, like it's no, but it's like, I don't see how going to the supermarket and only understanding half of the people there, what they're speaking, is somehow a strength. I don't see it in that way. I mean, look, I wish it would be nice, right? Wouldn't it be nice if all the peoples of the world could just come together and just give themselves a big old hug, like, but has that been the story?
Imagine all the people.
God, what a dystopian song that is, right? It is. It's frightening. It's like my parents they're boomers, right? They love John Lennon and the Beatles, and I'm like, it's like, but John Lennon, right, was also that guy who got on stage. He was probably high out of his mind when he did this, but he got into he was wearing like this fur coat, and I think he was probably tripping on acid, and he got into like a box or a barrel, and it's like, well, if we all just did drugs and wore fur coats and got into a barrel, there would be no war. And that was the point he was trying to make. And it's like, the man was clearly out of his mind. And when I listen to Imagine, I just think of this boring world where there's nothing to fight, there's no struggle, there's no glory, there's no great achievement to undertake, right? It's like, I don't know, like I grew up in the early 90s, early 2000s, and I remember watching this episode of this cartoon called The Fairly Odd Parents, right? And there was an episode where the main character, Timmy, wishes for the whole world to be made up of nothing but gray blobs, right? Everyone is a gray blob, so you can't tell anyone apart. Everyone's the same. And it was supposed to like remove all the prejudices and distinctions. And he ended up still getting picked on because his bullies were saying, well, I'm the grayest and the blobbiest. And that's like, it's like you can't remove, like, I'm sorry, it sucks, but you can't remove like prejudice and chauvinism and bigotry out of the human condition. It sucks.
Hierarchy.
Yeah. Like there's always going to be someone who claims they're grayer and blobbier than you. And that's just the story of human history. Like, I mean, and I've made peace with that. I think a lot of people who are, who really do believe in like the ascended consciousness aspects of like in spiral dynamics, they really do feel like we're going to overcome all of these differences and become like transhuman, I don't know, Superman. Like, I don't know. I just don't believe in it. It just doesn't seem likely to me.
Yeah, we just said on the last chat how turquoise is bullshit.
It is. No, turquoise is pure bullshit. It's gonna stop at yellow. Like, yellow is the best you're gonna get. Like it is. Like, I consider myself to be on like the yellow right, I guess. I'm trying to kind of bring all these different perspectives into like play.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, like there's no, like, turquoise is like it is literally saying like, oh, I'm grayer and blobbier than you. So I don't know. It's frustrating. It really is.
So a couple more things. We're getting to 2 hours here, but I want to. There's a couple of. I know, time flies. There's a couple more things I want to talk about. One is fascism.
Okay. Oh, you just want me to go off the cuff? Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, fascism is the big boogeyman, right? It's
dirty word.
Yeah, but fascism, we have to kind of contain fascism to a specific period in European history, right? So what was going on after the collapse of the last European monarchies and the introduction of liberal democracy to nations that never had liberal democracy before, right? What you saw was an influx of communist groups, of groups that were supported by the Soviet Union. I mean, look, there would have been no Nazis if it had not been for the Spartacist uprising in Emma Goldman and the Bavarian Soviet Socialist Republic. The degree to which European fascist regimes were hard-handed in their extremism, I think adequately reflected the degree of which their left-wing counterparts were also embodied that same extremism, right? It's why, Italy was a fascist state. It was the original fascist state. But was it, did it have the same kind of, what am I trying to say? Was it as bloody as National Socialist Germany, right? And I think Nazi Germany was uniquely different from the other fascist states that you saw in perhaps Italy and Romania under the Iron Guard, Franco is Spain, Salazar is Portugal. All of the southern, or maybe the more Latin fascist regimes were certainly repressive. They were authoritarian. But were they as bloody? No. And I think that had a lot to do with the degree in which communism actually affected those particular states. Now, with regards to National Socialism, I think its devastatingness was a reflection of Hitler's own megalomania. I really do think that the inner circle of the Nazi Party were thinking of, like, they had like a final society envisioned in the world. And it was just going to be like a global Reich, right? In which like Germany and its allies dominated all of human history from that point onward. But my thoughts on fascism, if I'm being honest, I think it represented a authentic conditional response to communist subversion. Does that mean that I had to like every aspect of fascism, that I think fascism was like this wonderful thing? No. But I think it was the necessary thing if I'm looking at it from like the perspective of the right. Because what would have been the alternative in that regard? Would it have been liberal democracy? No. The Weimar Republic would have just descended into a communist rule. It would have just been East Germany a few decades before, right? And I think the same would have happened with all the other states that kind of fell under fascism. But what makes fascism so interesting is it's easy to call like neo-fascists like reactionaries. And maybe the neo-fascists are reactionaries. But I think that fascism was a modern response. I think it was wholly modern. It used the technology of modernism And think about that. You see that in the ways in which Nazi Germany was able to implement the kind of pogroms that it did. It used the kind of, tallying and counting systems to kind of organize human beings into pure
Sure.
numbers.
But
right?
wasn't fascism trying to protect like traditionalism?
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, I think that was true in Romania and Spain. I don't think that
In
was
Italy?
true. I do. Well, Mussolini was an atheist, though. And I think that he made an alliance with the Catholic Church out of convenience. But I don't know whether or not if the Italian fascists were traditionalists. Maybe they were maybe a lot of them were Catholic. I don't doubt
Well, did you
that.
ever read The Doctrine of Fascism by Mussolini?
I actually haven't, because I was the only point in which I was a self-avowed fascist was like in high school, where I was just angry at them. Right. I kind of left that behind to get into like authentic traditionalism. But here's the other thing is, without fascism, I'm sorry, prior to fascism, you had the Italian futurist movement. And many of the Italian futurists became card-carrying fascists, many of them influential. Especially you had like guys like Marinetti, who wrote the Futurist Manifesto. So yeah, I feel like fascism was I don't see it as a mere reaction to kind of bring the world back to a kind of, like a medievalism, right? It was taking the, it was, it was taking the kind of in-group preference that you see in blue and amber ways of thinking, but also monopolizing on the technologies that the modern world had brought. Which, I mean, I myself am very sympathetic about that. But do I honestly see, like, do I see like fascism's like will to power and trying to like create like these vast overseas empires? I mean, I think the age of like empires is over. I feel like what we're having is the age of tribalization, and empires may not be complementary to that vision of the future. I think we're seeing the death of the kind of, great states, if you want to call it that. I don't even think, this is the thing I've had with neo-fascists as well, is it's the same thing with the traditionalists. It's like they want to turn back the clock to 1933. It's like, I mean, maybe the traditionalists want to go back further than that, but all of the neo-fascists that I've talked to, they just think, okay, the conditions have to be right. Like they just have to have 1933 conditions. But it's like, well, that's not going to happen. Like we're living in a different period of history. But yeah, no, like I would say that fascism was a modernist response to the other great theories of modernity, which were liberalism or democratic republicanism and communism, which is something that Alexander Dugin also points out. And I guess you could say, well, what I want is a kind of fourth political theory. Maybe not like a fourth political theory in the Duginite sense, although I'm very much inclined towards, Dugin. I'm sympathetic towards him, but I don't agree with him on necessarily everything. I think we are going to have to kind of come up with a new meta theory or meta narrative that does replace liberalism, because the foundations or the presuppositions of on which liberalism is founded on no longer or are increasingly making less and less sense as we kind of go further into the century. And I don't think a return to fascism would be beneficial, or I think it would be anachronistic. I mean, is the future like? And don't get me wrong, I do feel like there are going to be strong men. There are going to be strong men who are going to, be charismatic leaders in the future. I think that's going to happen. But are these people going to not necessarily be fascistic? Maybe in a kind of outward sense. But is the age of like, we're going to have like a single party and we're all going to be united under a leader figure and we're all going to be like wearing like paramilitary uniforms? No, I don't see that. I don't like. I mean, look at it. Like, look at some of the neo-fascist movements that managed to kind of overtake the alt-right, and I'm thinking specifically of the Traditionalist Workers' Party. And I have like, I mean, is you know, dressing up in all black and giving Roman salutes and quoting Hitler all the time, like, is that the way forward? I don't think it is. Like, that itself seems anachronistic. I mean, look, maybe if your whole, like, if the alpha and the omega of your way of thinking is race, yes, fascism or National Socialism is going to make a lot of sense to you, right? But look, I'm also like an Orthodox Christian, so I'm also kind of very skeptical of, these kind of race-based theories and trying to like achieve eugenic purity, and we're just going to be like ancient Sparta, which was also a National Socialist state. I want to emphasize, right? National Socialism did not originate in 1930s Germany. It originated in ancient Sparta, right? We're not going to just toss babies over a side of a cliff because they have like club foot or something. Like, no, I'm not advocating that. I'm generally opposed to anything that increases the possibility of human suffering. But I also know how debased and violent and the potential for horror that human beings can kind of like undertake. And I think there needs to be a preparedness for that. I think any sane person needs to understand, like, look, the possibility for violence is always going to be there. There's not going to be like, we're not going to go full turquoise, right? Like, we're not going to go full turquoise. Like, green problems require amber solutions. That's just the tragedy of the thing. Like,
green problems require amber solutions.
If they get bad enough, certainly.
Yeah, so turquoise should respect that.
I mean, you would think.
I can't see a way around turquoise being like just totally authoritarian.
It's fart sniffing. That's all it is. It's fart sniffing for people who think they're like holier than that. I don't even know. Like,
yeah, fair enough.
They're the big brains, right? Yeah.
Okay. The last topic I want to touch on is the Jews.
Oh, okay. The JQ.
The JQ.
Okay, well, what about like Jewishness would you like me to say? Like, do you want my opinion on like the state of Israel, or like just Jews in general? Or,
well, it's a good question. Are they a convenient scapegoat?
I think so. Yeah. Look, I'm not gonna lie. I have my own feelings about the influence of Judaism has had on Western culture, but I'm not gonna kind of like, look, I don't feel like Rabbi Shlomo at Shalom Temple has like a direct line to Benjamin Netanyahu. Like, I don't think that. I mean, look, generally I am supportive of the Palestinian cause, but I think that has more to do with my religious leanings, because I know people who are Palestinian Christians, and I emphasize with their plight. I will say this: I think the Israelis are a people who do possess blood and soil. I think you should actually make a distinction between Jews and Israelis. I think.
Right.
I mean, the Israelis are.
Oh, right. Yeah, so I'm not speaking of like the Israel versus Palestinian conflict.
Oh, okay. Well,
there's some on the right that like to make the argument about the Jewish group strategy undermining, national identities and so on and so forth.
No, I mean, yeah, that's existed since like forever. I mean, look, I think there's some truth to that. I think Jews do have a very powerful in-group consciousness. But look, a lot of that has also been a response to living in Gentile societies. I mean, it's really like the only way I could see this is that Jews probably need their own ethno-states, probably independent from. I think they do. Like, I think maybe they need their own ethno-states independent of of what formerly used to be called Christendom. Like, unless maybe they convert. And here's the thing, though, is I know people who are ethnically Ashkenazi, but have abandoned their Jewishness to become like Orthodox Christians. And once, like, it's really weird, actually. Like, I know a guy named Michael Witkoff, right? He's an Orthodox writer. He or YouTuber, actually. He has a channel called Brother Augustine. And the guy is an Ashkenazi Jew, and he looks very much like one. And he's also very anti-Jewish. Like, it's this weird thing.
I can understand that.
Yeah, it's like...
Nobody hates Jews more than Jews.
You know, you see that a lot with Jewish converts to Christianity. Like, you have a monk, there's an Orthodox monk named Brother Nathaniel, he said some very, very anti-Semitic things despite being an ethnic Jew himself. But I think a lot of that has just become like a part of like the Jew-Gentile debate, right? I have my own problems with Judaism because of what's written in the Talmud about Jesus, right? I mean, I think that's very unacceptable, right? But like, I don't have like a hatred of Jews as persons. I mean, I wish they.
What do they say about Jesus?
I honestly don't feel like I want to repeat that.
Okay,
I mean,
that's fine.
Do you really? I mean, is it like how?
You can Google.
Okay.
Hold on, my phone just responded to me saying that.
Yeah, it's very unpleasant.
Gotcha.
But no, like, I mean, I hope and pray that all Jews accept. And I'm guessing you're of a Jewish background yourself. Okay, well, there you go. So I hope you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior and as the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophets. But
I like the guy. I actually feel a stronger affinity for Christianity than Judaism.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you mind if I ask why? Is it because...
It's a good question, man, because I was like, in high school, I was like a militant atheist.
Okay.
And I was surrounded by Christians, and, you know, I learned all of the like logical fallacies, and, you know, I could run circles around them and so on and so forth. And it was actually through reading Wilbur, Brief History of Everything, that I stopped being an atheist.
Really? Okay. And
then I started to like open myself up to the merits of all the religions. And I started to read Christianity and, you know, learn about Christianity. And I liked Christ's vibe. And there's a lot of the teachings that I enjoyed. And maybe a lot of this has to do with my upbringing and, you know, disillusionment with what turned me into an atheist, right? Was disillusionment with, it was a lot of like temple politics and stuff like that.
Were you a part of a very conservative Jewish background? No.
No, it was Reform Judaism.
Okay.
So it's like real lukewarm Judaism.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, I'll put it like this. Like, my problems with Judaism, I think, are more theological than they are like Natsock-y. Like, they're not like, they're less racial, but more like religious. If I'm an anti-Semite, I'm probably as much as an anti-Semite as like some 19th century Russian peasant. Like, I'm certainly not an anti-Semite in the sense of like a card-carrying Nazi party official. But yeah, it's like, I feel like, modern or contemporary conservative Judaism is essentially Pharisaism. It is legitimate Pharisaism. It is so after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, basically, you know, the Pharisees got together and they thought, okay, well, temple's gone. How do we be Jews now, right? And the birth of that was essentially what is now conservative Judaism, or maybe Orthodox. I think it's Orthodox Judaism. My bad. And yeah, like, I just have like my theological disagreements with Judaism, I think, far outweigh maybe any like weird ethnic. I mean, obviously, like you and I can talk, and like I'm not frothing at the mouth, screaming horrible obscenities. Like it's not like that. Like I try to see people like, okay, well, we didn't choose our grandparents. That's the thing. We didn't choose our grandparents. Like, but as a believing Christian and looking at what's in the Talmud, it's like, oh man, this is not nice.
You have
So
beef, yeah.
yeah, but no, like, I mean, like no, like I'm not going to be like an apologist for like the concentration camps or the pogroms or something. That's not what I'm trying to do. But yeah, I mean, I guess my answer to you would be accept Jesus.
Okay, I will. On that note,
Okay.
man, this was a really fascinating conversation. I really appreciated the like plurality of right-wing thought, and it really seems like you're embarking on a real integral style project of synthesizing different kinds of views and sort of heading towards something new and integral.
I certainly hope so. Like, look, I don't want to be.
Yeah, and you
And
seem really
words,
humble. I really appreciate that quality.
well, thank you. That
And
that does.
willing to like question and throw out all your own views and presuppositions and all that.
Well, look, I mean, dogmatism is the death of free thought. Like, that's. I don't want to fall into. I don't want to be a dogmatic because if that's who I am, if I'm just repeating a prescribed set of talking points, then I mean that's the death of the intellect right there.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Well, you're very welcome.
We need more of that on the right and the left.
So is this where we part ways? Maybe give a conclusion? Or...
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I mean,
Well,
it's
that
been
was my conclusion. Well, do you have
okay.
one?
I mean, it's been a good time. I really appreciate it. You having me on. And maybe in the future we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, sure. I would love to. There's probably a lot more to discuss here. There was so much stuff that came up that I had questions about. So for
Okay.
sure, I'm totally open to that. And next time I'm in Texas, I'll hit you up.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, we can get together for a shoot. What's the beer? What's the Texas beer?
Oh, Shiner or
Yeah, Shinerbach.
okay, there we go. Okay. Well,
All right,
thank you
man.
for having me on.
God bless. Namaste. Shalom. All that stuff.
All right.
Peace be with you.
And with your spirit.
Thank you.